From time to time, people ask me a question that goes something like this. How hard is it to come up with a new sermon every week? Well, that's actually a fairly difficult question. It's a difficult question because the truth is that sometimes writing a sermon is, frankly, fairly easy. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it takes a few hours and sometimes it takes many. Let me give you an example. A few weeks ago, our text was the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, I took the Gospel of Luke when I was in seminary. I had to write a paper on this. I had read all the commentaries. I was very familiar with the text. So when it came time to sit down and write the sermon, really the only thing I had to do was choose between several different ideas that the commentators had given me that I thought would be good for an interpretation. The sermon almost wrote itself. And there are a lot of texts like that. Texts that are nice and tidy and self-contained and familiar. Texts that can stand on their own without hardly even looking at their context. So when a preacher comes to a text like that, well, it's really not all that hard to come up with a sermon. But then there are texts like the ones today. These are the type of texts that when I say the word of the Lord and you reply, thanks be to God, I wonder if we really are thankful to hear some of these words, right? I've chose to focus on the Luke passage. And when I looked at it, I will confess to you, I had absolutely no idea what to do with this passage from Luke. First of all, it's relatively brief. And then there are at least two and maybe three distinct things going on here, sort of choppy, little bits and pieces. And second, there's no real story, there's no parable, there's no narrative, there's nothing really to play with and expand upon. And finally, to be honest, I've never been all that comfortable dealing with this topic of Jesus coming back. You see, I've seen way too much manipulation used by way too many ministers on stuff like this when it comes to talking about the return of Christ. You know, I've never been comfortable with this idea of trying to scare someone into heaven. It doesn't make sense to me. I thought the gospel was supposed to be good news. So what do we do with a text like this? Well, whenever I get stuck, and I'm going to take you inside a little bit the sermon writing world today, whenever I get stuck when approaching a text, I try a few of the interpretation tricks I was taught while in seminary. For example, one of the things you can do is try and figure out what a text is doing. Now, what do I mean by that? In other words, look at a text and try to see if it's teaching us, or comforting us, or rebuking us, or confronting us. Because if you can figure that out, that's probably what you need to do in the sermon. Another trick, and this one is a little more abstract, is to try and figure out what color a text is. Now, what do I mean? For example, if a text is a comfortable and warm text, we might think of it as sort of a cool pastel. But if a text is one where it's about judgment, like our passage from Isaiah today, well, maybe it would be a bright color like fire. But my favorite trick, perhaps because of my background in music and music education, was to try to think of a text as a movie and figure out what the soundtrack would be. Now, sometimes this is rather easy and obvious. For example, it would be pretty hard to preach on the text in Exodus when Moses has led the Hebrews up to the edge of the sea and Pharaoh's armies are bearing down on him and the wind has kicked up and you feel the mist from the sea. It would be hard to preach on that without hearing the music from the movie 10 Commandments and seeing Charlton Heston standing there with the people, his staff raised against the tempest, the wind sweeping through his hair and beard. Or think about Christmas time. The birth narratives of Jesus from Matthew and Luke. How can we read those texts without hearing our favorite Christmas carols in our heads? So, what about this text? what would be its soundtrack? Well, I thought about it quite a bit this week. And when I finally decided what it was, the whole sermon sort of opened up before me. Now, I know that all of you are sitting there eagerly on the edge of your seats, waiting to find out what my choice of music is. But before I get to that, I want to pick this text apart just a little bit. Now, the 12th chapter of Luke's gospel takes place right after Jesus has had a very public and fierce confrontation with the religious leaders in Palestine. In fact, the last verses of chapter 11 tell us that the scribes and Pharisees had become hostile toward Jesus and were lying in wait to catch him saying something wrong. And they had reason to be worried, because as chapter 12 opens, we find out that people have begun to gather around Jesus by the thousands. In other words, he's becoming a threat. And Jesus wastes no time in condemning his opponents. In fact, one of his first quotes in this chapter is this: "Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, that is their hypocrisy." Now, that's not exactly what a man says when he's extending an olive branch out to his enemy, is it? And most of the rest of the chapter is a series of instructions to his followers. A lot of it has to do with possessions, worldly stuff, in other words. But a lot of it, especially our text today, has to do with the kingdom. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? Well, that's kind of a complicated answer. A lot of the material here has to do with being ready for Christ's coming, being prepared for his return. Because he is coming. And we want to make sure that we have well-constructed purses, that we are dressed for action, that we have our lamps lit and are looking out for the thief that comes in the night. But the question about all this is when. When is all that going to happen? What do we mean when we say that God's kingdom is breaking into the world? Well, there are a lot of ways to answer that. A lot of people today think that things will go something like this, and I'm sure you have heard this. Jesus came a long time ago. Then he left. Someday he's going to come back. In the meantime, we're all just stuck here on earth waiting for him. In other words, in this idea, the kingdom referred to in today's text is something that's going to happen sometime in the future, and we just have to wait and be ready, because it might happen sometime soon, or it might happen sometime later. But at any rate, it's not happening now. I was wandering through one of our local bookstores recently, and I saw a lot of books in the Christian section that taught exactly this sort of mindset, that taught this sort of idea. They said something to the effect that the kingdom was briefly back there behind us when Jesus was around, and now it's way, way out there in front of us, but it's not really here with us right now. In fact, if you want to make a lot of money as a Christian author, you can write a book saying just that. It's what a lot of Christians want to believe, including the people I was talking about earlier, the ones who want to scare people into heaven, who want to say that we really don't have to worry about what's going on today because it's all about the past or it's all about the future. Who want to say that the kingdom is all about heaven and has nothing to do with the here and now and how we are trying to live as disciples of Jesus Christ. And to that idea, I say they are absolutely wrong. The kingdom of heaven is about what's going on right now. In fact, I think Jesus tells us to be ready here, not because we don't know what's going to happen in the future when he comes, but because we might miss an opportunity to encounter him when he comes right now in our lives. You know, in another place, Jesus describes the kingdom as being like a mustard seed. It starts off small, so small that we might not even notice it. But then it starts to grow and grow and grow. And if we aren't paying attention, we might miss an opportunity to get on board with this kingdom building and see what's happening and to be a part of what Jesus and his kingdom are doing right now, here, right where we live. We might miss an opportunity to be a part of what Jesus is doing. You see, despite what all those TV preachers might tell you, the way God's kingdom really works is like this. Little by little, bit by bit, more and more, it's breaking into the world. And if we aren't ready, if we aren't prepared, if we don't have our lamps lit, and if we aren't watching out for the thief that comes by night, then we might miss it. We might not be a part of it right now. If all we are doing is looking for Jesus to appear to us way out there in the future, then we are going to miss the ways he comes to us each and every day. Do you remember the place in Matthew's gospel where Jesus separates everyone into sheep and goats? Jesus condemns the goats for missing the opportunity to serve him by recognizing him in the eyes of fellow human beings. And he praises the sheep for serving their fellow human beings, even though they didn't know it was really Jesus' eyes they were looking into. The sheep, they didn't even know what they had done. They said, "Lord, when was it that we did this?" And Jesus replied, "Just as you did it to one of the least of these who are my brethren, you did it unto me." You see, my friends, Jesus comes to us each and every day. He's not just out there in the future somewhere waiting on us. He is right here now every day. And we will see him if we are ready. If we have our lamps lit and our eyes open, we will see him. Especially we will see him in the eyes of the other human beings we meet every day. And maybe if we understand this, we will understand the kingdom a little better too. Maybe we will know that the kingdom is at work right now, right here, if we only had our lamps lit and we were looking for it. It may start off small, but it's going to grow. And it may start off slow, but it's going to build momentum. But make no mistake, the kingdom is at work right now if we just open our eyes and look. So, what is the soundtrack for all of this? Well, I think I have my answer. In many ways, in my eyes, the world today mirrors the world of the 1960s. There are unpopular wars, political unrest, a sense of unease. People are unhappy. People are angry. They are marching in the streets, and we are all shouting at each other. And in the middle of all this mess we find ourselves, we might be tempted to wonder if God is really here. If the kingdom is really present now. If we need to light our lamps and be ready to see ways that we can serve the kingdom now, or if we just need to sit back and not worry about what's going on and not care what's happening in our lives and our community. Well, back in the 60s, right in the middle of that mess, this group called the Impressions wrote a song. Some of you remember the Impressions, right? And you know, the more I think about it, the more the words of this song reminds me of the way God's kingdom is moving and working in our world. And the words go like this. People, get ready. There's a train coming. You don't need no baggage. You just get on board. All you need is faith, to hear the diesels humming. Don't need no ticket. You just thank the Lord. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.